Welcome to the Deep Dive.
Mm.
You're here because you're the kind of person who wants to really grasp those big, complex ideas that shape our world, right?
hmm
You want to cut through the noise and get to the heart of the matter, those aha moments that just make things click. We get it, and that's exactly what we're about.
Think of this as your backstage pass to understanding. We've sifted through the foundational stuff, the really dense material, and we're bringing you the key debates, the crucial insights, and hopefully a few things that will genuinely surprise you.
Today, we're plunging into a concept that pops up everywhere, especially if you've ever explored philosophy or political theory, ideology. It's a word we hear constantly, but as we're about to discover, pinning down its precise meaning is trickier than it sounds.
For this deep dive, you shared the entry on ideology from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's a fantastic piece because it lays out the diverse ways thinkers have approached this idea, the major disagreements, and why understanding these nuances is so essential for making sense of the world and, well, even our own beliefs.
Our mission today is to really unpack this philosophical landscape of ideology. We want to explore the different ways philosophers understand it, the core debates that keep resurfacing, and ultimately, why all of this matters for how we see ourselves and the societies we live in.
And we're starting with a bit of a head-scratcher, aren't we? The term ideology seems to have so many different lives. I mean, it can refer to a complete worldview, the stories we tell ourselves to justify the status quo, a specific political
The
stance.
very air of our culture.
Right. Or beliefs that might be totally wrong but prop up unfair power structures, the things that glue a group together, or even just a systematic way of misleading people. It's a lot.
Exactly. It's all over the map. And that makes you wonder, is there even one central idea tying all these different uses of ideology together? Or is it more like a collection of related but ultimately quite different ideas?
That's the initial challenge that entry highlights.
Yeah.
And connected to that is another really fundamental tension. Is ideology inherently a negative thing, something we should always be suspicious of? Or is it simply a neutral way of describing certain kinds of ideas and beliefs?
Because you hear it used in both ways, don't you?
hmm
On the one hand, it's criticized for being tangled up with injustice, for creating biases that blind us, for spreading illusions, and for fostering a kind of rigid, unthinking dogmatism.
But on the other hand, thinkers also use ideology in a much more neutral way. They might talk about locating it in our individual thoughts, in the shared culture around us, in the institutions that shape our lives, and the way we talk about things.
Or even in everyday rituals, right? Things we do without thinking.
Exactly. In the everyday rituals we perform without even consciously thinking about them. Yeah.
Okay, so it's this really multifaceted thing. And that leads us to the big questions we want to delve into in this deep dive. What are the core disagreements about this idea of being partial or taking sides in relation to ideology?
Mm.
Is it primarily about what's going on in our heads? Is it cognitive?
Mm.
Or is it more about the way we live and the cultures we inhabit? Is it non-cognitive?
Precisely. We'll also be asking, can we ever truly escape ideology? Is it inherently something negative, something that always leads to trouble? And perhaps most importantly, how does ideology connect to the big issues of social justice and oppression? How does it help to either maintain or challenge those kinds of conditions? These are the threads we're going to be pulling on today.
Let's jump into the first area the Stanford entry lays out, the different traditions of ideology theory. And it's fascinating that even though we often associate ideology with Marxism and critical theory, the concept actually has roots in both liberal and conservative thought.
That's right. The term itself is usually credited to Antoine Louis-Claude de Tracy, back in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. He was part of this intellectual group in France, the ideologues, and he envisioned ideology as a science of ideas. Think of it like biology or zoology, but focused on understanding the origins and development of our thoughts.
So initially, it wasn't this loaded political term we often think of. It was meant to be a kind of neutral, even positive project, a way to bring reason and empirical observation to the study of how we think.
Exactly. De Tracy and his fellow ideologues saw this science of ideas as a tool for social reform through education. They believed that by understanding how our ideas are formed, we could develop a more rational and just society. He even wrote a book called Elements of Ideology, which covered things like reasoning, morality, and political economy.
Okay, so the early liberal conception of ideology was actually about overcoming error and achieving a kind of enlightened understanding through reason and education.
Right.
It was seen as a solution to false consciousness, not the cause of it. There's a real twist there, considering how we often use the term today. It's like what was once seen as the medicine is now sometimes viewed as the illness.
Absolutely. And that core idea of overcoming bias and partisanship remains a thread in modern liberal approaches to ideology. Think about the emphasis on critical thinking, scientific methods, and reasonableness in liberal education. The goal is often to equip people to guard against things like extremism and confirmation bias, which are now frequently seen as negative manifestations of ideology.
And within this liberal tradition, there are further distinctions, right? Some thinkers differentiate between specific ideologies as rigid and unreasonable systems of thought versus broader religious or ethical worldviews.
hmm
Others take a more inclusive approach, considering all comprehensive doctrines and then judging whether their adherents are reasonable or not.
Exactly. And there's also a practical political dimension within liberalism. How should liberal societies deal with these unreasonable ideologies? Some advocate for a strict separation, a neutral public sphere where policy is justified in terms acceptable to everyone.
While others argue for a more active approach.
Yeah, others argue for a more active approach, including civic education or even stronger measures to prevent what they see as dangerous ideologies from gaining traction.
That brings us to the conservative perspective on ideology. And it sounds like they've been a bit more consistent in their use of the term, often seeing it in a more negative light right from the start.
Yes, the conservative critique of ideology really crystallized with Napoleon Bonaparte's attacks on those same ideologues we were just talking about. He saw their rationalism and materialism as a threat to traditional Christian values and social order. For conservatives, ideology became associated with any political project that tries to impose a rational, abstract doctrine onto the complexities of social and political life.
So it's a skepticism towards this idea of social engineering, the notion that we can just rationally design a better society from scratch.
Right.
They see wisdom in tradition, in the accumulated experience of generations, and worry that these abstract ideologies oversimplify things and can lead to unintended negative consequences.
Precisely. Thinkers in this tradition, like Hume and later Oakeshott, express a deep skepticism about applying abstract rational principles to the messy reality of politics. They see ideologies as often deriving from realms outside of practical political experience like war, religion, or even business, and becoming problematic when these alien logics take over the political sphere.
It's a concern about losing touch with the practical, lived experience of politics and imposing a rigid theoretical framework onto something that's inherently more organic and nuanced.
Exactly. And this isn't just about being anti-rational in general. Conservatives often argue that ideologies themselves are actually simplifications or rationalizations of past experiences. They can be useful in certain contexts, maybe for new political groups, but they become dangerous when they become detached from that grounding in real-world political practice.
Now let's turn to the Marxist tradition, which, as the Stanford entry points out, has produced the most extensive and varied body of thought on ideology. And it sounds like there's a real tension within Marxism between either embracing or debunking the aims of the Enlightenment.
Absolutely. On one hand, Marxists were drawn to the radical promise of the Enlightenment, the idea of liberation and social progress. But on the other hand, they also aim to expose how those very Enlightenment ideals and the ideologies that express them could be used to mask and justify social domination and violence.
So there's this element of unmasking, showing the hidden interests and power dynamics that might be lurking beneath seemingly noble ideas.
hmm
And then there's also the argument that simply changing people's minds through ideological projects isn't enough. What's really needed is fundamental economic and political transformation.
Exactly. In Marx's own work, he saw the Ideologues Project as a prime example of ideology, this unproductive intellectual activity that he believed was somewhat detached from the material realities of economic production. He argued that our social position and the way society is structured economically actually shapes our consciousness and our ideas.
So for Marx, the German ideology of his contemporaries, and even aspects of political economy, law, and religion, could be seen as ideological because they created an illusion of independence from these underlying material conditions.
Right.
It's like the people working in this superstructure, the realm of ideas and culture, start to believe that their ideas are driving society, when in fact it's the other way around.
Right. And Engels later elaborated on this with the concept of false consciousness, the idea that our material life conditions ultimately determine the development of our thought, even if we're not consciously aware of it. The ideologist, in this view, operates with a kind of blindness to these economic forces.
And because Marx and Engels didn't lay out a fully systematic theory of ideology, later Marxist thinkers have tried to piece it together by connecting these scattered comments with other key themes in their work.
Precisely. One major approach links ideology to the social determination of ideas or consciousness, with class and class struggle seen as the fundamental driving forces. So ideology becomes understood as how different forms of consciousness arise from and serve particular class interests.
Another interpretation focuses on Marx and Engels' claim that the thoughts of the dominant class are in every epoch the dominant thoughts. This leads to the dominant ideology thesis, the idea that the ruling class develops a set of beliefs that reflect and serve their interests, and that these ideas are largely adopted by the subordinate classes, helping to maintain their subordination.
But as the Stanford entry points out, there's a tension here. Is ideology just any partisan class idea, or is it specifically the ruling ideas? One suggests a more neutral view, while the other carries a more critical, pejorative charge.
And then there's the connection some theorists have drawn between Marx's concept of fetishism in capital and ideology.
Yeah, that's a big one.
This argues that capitalist society, with its separation of production and consumption through the market, creates a kind of mystification where social relations appear as relations between things, operated by some unseen, almost magical force. This, they argue, is a form of ideology. Think of it like how we might focus so much on the price tag and brand of a product that we forget about the actual labor and resources that went into making it.
Although, as the entry notes, Marx himself didn't explicitly call fetishism ideology, but it's an interesting connection that brings the concept back to the specifically modern, commercial context from which it initially emerged.
Moving into the broader Marxist tradition after Marx and Engels, it seems ideology became even more explicitly tied to political action and the struggle between classes.
Yes, because Marxism developed as a movement, ideology often referred to the ways in which people became aware of the class contradictions in society and how they engaged in that struggle. It had both a theoretical and a practical political dimension, the set of beliefs that justified a party's actions and aimed to win supporters.
And in more polarized political contexts, like with Lenin, there was this tendency to see all ideologies through the lens of the fundamental conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, leading to this idea of a binary choice, either bourgeois or socialist ideology.
Which could then lead to equating socialist ideology, the correct party line, with class consciousness, and any deviation as false consciousness. This is where the more dogmatic and prescriptive uses of ideology in some Marxist circles originated.
But then you have thinkers like Lukács and the Frankfurt School who took this idea of false consciousness in a different direction, connecting it to broader themes of alienation and reification in capitalist society.
Right.
For them, it wasn't just about getting the correct political line. It was about how these dominant ideologies obscured our understanding of ourselves and our relationships in a fundamentally distorted way.
Exactly. They saw false consciousness as not simply a lack of scientific understanding, but as something intertwined with the increasing dominance of rational calculation and formal rationality in modern life. Their critique of ideology became closely linked to a critique of alienation, how the things we create end up controlling us, and reification, how we come to see social relations as fixed and thing-like, rather than fluid and human-made.
And from this perspective, Marx's discussion of commodity fetishism could be seen as a key example of this impersonal form of social domination at work. It also connects to Hegelian ideas about the limitations of abstract understanding versus a more dialectical reason.
And even to Freudian ideas about how ideologies can provide substitute gratifications for unmet needs.
Yeah. Then you have another major strand in Marxist thought, represented by Antonio Gramsci, who shifted the focus towards culture and institutions as the very terrain of political struggle. He saw ideology less as just a set of beliefs and more as something deeply embedded in our popular consciousness and cultural practices.
So for Gramsci, it was about how a socialist movement could build leadership by connecting Marxist theory with these other elements of popular culture, eventually building a broad coalition, a historic bloc, and achieving hegemony or dominance over society. This seems to move away from the idea of ideology as simply false consciousness and towards a more descriptive analysis of cultural forces.
Precisely. And this line of thinking has been influential in areas like cultural studies. Thinkers like Althusser built on this, arguing that ideology isn't just a set of ideas, but something material, embedded in our practices and institutions. He famously said that ideology interpellates individuals as subjects,
Interpellus.
meaning it shapes how we see ourselves and our place in the world, making us feel like autonomous agents within a framework of norms and expectations. It's like ideology is constantly calling out to us, shaping our identities and our sense of belonging.
And Althusser had some pretty strong claims about ideology, right? He argued that it's not just a symptom of class struggle or something that will disappear in a communist future, but a fundamental structure necessary for any society to function. So for him, ideology wasn't necessarily a pejorative term.
Exactly. He contrasted ideology with science, seeing science as a more objective, knowledge-producing endeavor. And his idea of interpolation, how ideology hails us as subjects, has been hugely influential, taken up and debated by thinkers in various fields, from sociology to feminist theory.
Okay, so we've covered these major traditions of thought on ideology, liberal, conservative, and Marxist, with all its internal variations. Now, the Stanford entry moves on to how we can actually map ideology, given all these different understandings. It suggests three key ways to classify different conceptions of ideology.
That's right. The first way is by valence, is the use of ideology critical or pejorative, suggesting something negative? Or is it neutral or descriptive, simply identifying a type of belief or cultural phenomenon? And as we've seen, there's a wide spectrum here.
And this often ties back to those differing commitments to impartiality versus the potential value of taking sides, right?
Oh,
If you believe in a strong ideal of objectivity and universal truth, then ideology might naturally seem like a distortion. But if you think knowledge and action always arise from a particular perspective, then ideology might seem more like an inevitable and sometimes even necessary part of social life.
exactly. The second way to map ideology is by location. Where do we actually find it? Is it primarily in our thoughts and beliefs, a cognitive approach? Or is it more deeply embedded in our habits, cultural practices, and rituals, a culturalist approach?
And this distinction often reflects different theories of human agency, doesn't it? If you see humans as primarily rational, intentional actors, you're more likely to focus on the cognitive aspects of ideology, our beliefs and values. But if you emphasize the pre-reflective and embodied dimensions of our actions, you might look more towards cultural habits and practices.
Precisely. The third aspect is scope. What kinds of ideas or cultural elements actually qualify as ideological? Is it all ideas, or only those with a certain kind of content, a specific social function, a particular origin, or certain effects?
And here, the key seems to be that most theorists agree that ideology somehow pertains to social life. It's either caused by social factors, has social consequences about society in some way, or serves some kind of social function.
That social function aspect is particularly interesting and often debated. For some, especially within a critical Marxist tradition, a key function of ideology is to establish or reinforce oppression.
Right.
But for others, like Althusser, the function might be more about constituting individuals as subjects, regardless of whether that involves oppression. And as the entry points out, attributing a function raises tricky questions about causality and how these functions actually get fulfilled.
Okay, so with these three ways of mapping ideology, valence, location, and scope, we can start to make sense of the diverse ways the term is used and the underlying assumptions that shape those uses. Now, the final part of the Stanford entry looks at different kinds of ideology critique, the ways in which ideologies can be found to be faulty.
Yes, and it breaks this down into three main lines of critique: rational faults, moral faults, and epistemic faults.
Let's start with rational faults. Here, the criticism is that an ideology leads us to act in ways that are actually against our own interests. It's about being partial to something or taking a partisan stance that ultimately undermines our well-being.
And the entry makes a really important point here. The connection between rationality and interests is tight, but so is the connection between interests and partiality.
Mm-hmm.
So criticizing an ideology for being interest undermining often depends on having a clear idea of what our real interests are and whether an ideology is truly preventing us from pursuing them. It makes you wonder, are our interests always as clear-cut as we think they are?
It's not always straightforward, is it? For example, someone might prioritize short-term gains over long-term interests or individual benefits over collective ones. Are those necessarily irrational? It seems like those are more about different values or time horizons.
Exactly. The critique of rationally faulty ideology really focuses on situations where, due to social factors, we become attached to or supportive of things that objectively harm us in a way that if we fully understood the situation, we would likely resist.
And this brings up the big question of whether the dominated, those who are oppressed or disadvantaged, are particularly prone to these kinds of rationally faulty ideologies. This is the classic idea of false consciousness, leading people to believe in the very system that oppresses them. It's a powerful and unsettling idea.
This is a really central and contested idea in the study of ideology. Why don't the victims of oppression always rise up? One potential answer is that they've internalized a distorted view of reality that makes their subordination seem just or necessary.
But the entry calls this the not very bright thesis and raises some serious doubts. It seems problematic to just assume that entire groups of people are consistently irrational in this way. So, what are some of the proposed mechanisms for how this kind of interest undermining false consciousness might arise?
Well, one common explanation is sociological.
Hmm.
Indoctrination through education, coercive socialization, and the dominant group controlling the means of communication and expert authority to promote their own worldview.
Uh-huh.
The idea is that the dominant narrative becomes internalized, even by those at disadvantages. It's like a constant drip feed of ideas that eventually shapes how we see things.
But there are counter-arguments to this, aren't there? For example, the entry points out that those who are socioeconomically disadvantaged might actually have less exposure to elite media and expert opinions, and they might also have their own sources of knowledge and resistance based on their lived experiences. Their everyday struggles might give them a very different perspective on how society actually works.
Precisely. The entry also highlights how even the dominant ideologies often contain contradictions or ideals that can be used by the subordinate to challenge the status quo. Think about appeals to fairness or equality, even within systems that are fundamentally unequal.
Right.
And throughout history, subordinate groups have developed their own counter-narratives and critiques of dominant power structures. Think of slave songs or underground newspapers.
So, this idea of the dominated being simply brainwashed into accepting their oppression seems too simplistic. What about psychological mechanisms that might contribute to this?
Some theories suggest things like unwarranted generalizations, where people extrapolate from their local experiences to make faulty conclusions about society as a whole. For instance, someone who has one positive interaction with a member of a dominant group might generalize that experience to deny systemic inequalities. There's also stereotype threat, where the fear of confirming negative stereotypes can actually affect behavior in ways that seem to validate the stereotype. And then there's preference adaptation, the idea that we might unconsciously adjust our desires to fit our limited circumstances, making us believe we don't want things we actually do or deserve. It's like settling for less because you've been led to believe that's all you can have.
But again, the entry raises questions about these mechanisms. Are these genuine cases of internalized false consciousness, or are they more about strategic adaptation to difficult circumstances, or even just misrepresenting our desires in the face of power?
It's tricky to disentangle. Someone might say they don't want something because they know it's unattainable, not because they truly don't desire it.
It is. And ultimately, the entry suggests that the idea that the dominated are simply partisans of their own subordination might be an illusion. The fact that people don't always openly revolt doesn't necessarily mean they've internalized the dominant ideology. There can be many other reasons for quiescence, fear of reprisal, lack of resources, or simply not seeing a viable alternative. And it flips the question around. Are the dominant especially prone to rationally faulty ideology? And here, the entry seems to suggest there might be more evidence.
Yes, the classic problem of tyrants being surrounded by flatterers is a good example. If those in power only hear what they want to hear, they can develop a distorted view of reality, underestimating opposition, and making irrational decisions that ultimately undermine their own interests.
It's like being in a bubble.
It's like being in an echo chamber of power, where dissenting voices are silenced, and you start to believe your own hype. Frederick Douglass's point about slaveholders losing the ability to reason because they were never challenged by their slaves is a powerful example of this. Their privileged position insulated them from the reality of their actions.
Absolutely. Now, let's move on to morally faulty ideology. Here, the criticism is that an ideology leads us to be complicit in injustice, to be partial to or take a partisan stance in favor of something that is morally wrong.
But the entry makes a distinction here, right? If we're supporting an unjust system simply because it benefits us, that's more often seen as a conflict of interest, not necessarily a case of ideology critique.
Yeah, that's more self-interest.
It's more about self-interest than a deeply held belief system.
Exactly. The focus of morally faulty ideology critique is more on how we become complicit in injustice, even when we might not intend to, perhaps because of our social position or the way we're situated within existing power structures. The question shifts from why do they support this unjust system to why do we all accept and reproduce it? It's about the subtle ways that our everyday actions and beliefs can contribute to larger systems of injustice.
And this connects to broader discussions of structural injustice and social psychology, trying to understand why people often accept an unjust status quo. But the entry notes that the reasons for this can be complex, often involving ignorance, uncertainty about what to do, and the potential costs of challenging established norms. It's not always easy to see the ways we might be unintentionally contributing to harm.
And it points out a potential disconnect between the literature on social norms and the literature on ideology in this area. However, it suggests that ideology critique can play a role in helping people out of these suboptimal situations by reframing the choices we face or highlighting new possibilities for just action. It can help us see that things don't have to be the way they are.
So it's about using social theory to expose how our seemingly neutral actions might be contributing to injustice and to envision alternative ways of acting.
Hmm.
It's about challenging the taken-for-granted assumptions that underpin unjust systems.
Precisely. Finally, we come to epistemically faulty ideology. Here, the criticism is that an ideology leads us to believe things that are untrue or epistemically dubious, that it makes us partial to falsehoods. This seems like a really fundamental way that ideology can be problematic.
And this seems to be the broadest category of critique, broken down into faults of scope, faults of modality, and faults of reflective endorsement.
Well,
Let's unpack those. What are faults of scope?
faults of scope occur when we mistakenly take something particular or local to be universal, or vice versa, because of our social position or interests. The classic example is representing a particular group's interest as the universal interest of everyone. Charles Mills's critique of the social contract tradition, where justice often seems to mean just us for white people, is a powerful illustration of this. It's about a limited perspective masquerading as a complete picture.
It's about mistaking our own limited perspective for the full picture, or conversely, failing to see the particularity of our own experiences and assuming they apply to everyone. So assuming that what works in your small town will definitely work in a massive city would be a fault of scope in the other direction, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And what about faults of modality?
Faults of modality happen when we confuse what is contingent, something that could be different, with what is necessary or inevitable, or the other way around. The critique of reification or naturalization falls into this category, where social constructs like institutions or conventions are treated as if they were natural laws beyond human control. For example, saying that capitalism is simply human nature is treating a historically specific economic system as if it were an unchangeable fact.
This is about making the socially constructed seem natural and unchangeable, which can obviously hinder efforts for social change. And the opposite error would be to see something that is actually necessary or a result of underlying structural forces is merely a matter of individual choice, like scapegoating individuals for systemic problems like poverty or unemployment.
Exactly. Finally, there are faults of reflective endorsement. This is when we believe something not because of good reasons or evidence, but because of social factors. And if we were to become aware of those social factors, it would actually undermine our belief. Engels' idea of false consciousness fits here, where the economic motivations behind our beliefs are hidden from us. It's like holding a belief because everyone around you does, without ever really examining why.
So it's about beliefs that can't withstand scrutiny, beliefs that we hold only because of some background condition we're not fully aware of, like being in a coercive environment or being part of an echo chamber where our views are never challenged. If you realized you only held a certain political view because your entire family did and you never considered alternatives, that would be a lack of reflective endorsement.
Precisely. And often, these different kinds of epistemic faults can overlap and reinforce each other. Ideologies that are shielded from criticism might suffer from faults of reflective endorsement, but they're also likely to exhibit skewed scope and mistaken notions of necessity.
So this deep dive into the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on ideology has really shown us just how complex and multifaceted this concept is. We started by seeing the wide range of meanings attached to it and the central tension between it being seen as something negative or just descriptive.
We then explored the major traditions of thought: the early liberal view of ideology as a science of ideas for social reform, the conservative critique of rationalistic social engineering, and the extensive and often contradictory Marxist approaches, from debunking to radicalizing the aims of the Enlightenment.
We looked at three key ways to map ideology: its valence, whether it's seen positively or negatively; its location, whether it's in our minds or in our culture; and its scope, what kinds of ideas or cultural elements it encompasses.
And finally, we delved into the three main lines of ideology critique: Rational fault, where ideology undermines our interests, moral fault, where it leads to complicity and injustice, and epistemic faults, where it results in untruths or epistemically dubious beliefs.
So, given all these diverse and often conflicting understandings of ideology, here's a thought for you to take away. How can you critically examine the ideas and beliefs that shape your own understanding of the world and your place within it?
Consider which valence, location, and scope of ideology resonates most with your own experiences and observations. Think about potential rational, moral, or epistemic pitfalls in your own belief systems.
And maybe, just maybe, reflect on whether some of your own deeply held perspectives might be seen as ideological from another point of view. It's a challenging thought, but one that's crucial for navigating our complex world with a bit more awareness and critical insight. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.